Welcome to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm your instructor for this course. And today we're going to be covering Chapter 20, A Global Power, 1914 to 1919. This is part 1 of the lecture. And we're going to open up, as we always do, these chapters with an American portrait. It's going to be of Walter Lippmann. He was actually a reporter. He was caught in Belgium at the outbreak of World War I. And as you realize from this time frame, this actually covers World War I. So that's going to be a large focus of this chapter, is World War I. So anyway, Walter Lippmann was a reporter. He was caught in Belgium at the outbreak of World War I. So really, he's in the midst of everything. He was a progressive and a journalist, and he was representing the publication in New Republic. So he actually sees the horrors of World War I firsthand, and the inevitability of progress becomes kind of his drumbeat throughout this. He sees that progress is going to push forward, technology's pushing forward as he sees the war advancing, the modernity of war, technology, how it wins out in the end with war. And we'll be talking about what happens with World War I and the brutality of World War I and how it ultimately plays out with technology and the effect technology has on the outcome of World War I. And the carnage of World War I, he sees it firsthand. He sees the effects of things like mustard gas. Some of us probably go, well, what's mustard gas? Well, we're kind of immune to what mustard gas did and what it was, because we now outlaw these kind of weapons. They're chemical weapons. You've probably heard the flares that we've kind of thrown out at countries that employ biological and chemical weapons. The reason that is out of World War I and what effects mustard gas had on people. It was a very brutal, very vicious weapon that was employed in World War I, and the effects that it had on people. It's essentially a chemical weapon that would burn, it brutally burned your airways. It scarred your face, it could scar your eyes, leave you blind, and ultimately, if it got inhaled, it would destroy your lungs, your airways, and it would suffocate you. It was a very horrific death, to say the least, leaving you completely and utterly devastated, slowly suffocated to death. And if it didn't suffocate you, it left you blind and incapacitated in that way. And sometimes you didn't die immediately. Sometimes it would just scar your airways enough so it would compromise you, your breathing enough, so you would die a slow, painful death. So you didn't die outright. You would die very, very slowly. But we'll be talking more about that. And there was also other methods of death that were employed. We'll be talking about some of the other weapons beyond chemical that were employed in World War I. But more on that unhappy grimness that will be the brutality of this First World War. Before we even get to that, we have the challenge of revolution. And one of the first revolutions that we talk about in this chapter is, of course, the Mexican Revolution and Francisco Madero's revolt. He actually had overthrown dictator Porfirio Diaz, and as things go in Latin America during this period of time, the United States watches things in Latin America and ultimately will get involved and will actually wind up making things dramatically worse. And this is no exception to the rule with the Mexican Revolution. Now, there's a coup by General Victoriano Huerta that begins a civil war. And this resistance, led by Emiliano Zapata and Venustiano Carranza, kind of begins to intensify the whole situation. Well, ultimately, we decide to get involved in the situation. We decide to intervene and support a group of rebels. Now, ultimately, when we start supporting rebels in any country, not just Latin America, but in any country, things often go sideways. And this is no exception to the rule, because the Wilson administration winds up backing someone who some of you may be very unfortunately familiar with. It turns out we wind up backing Pancho Villa. You're probably going, wait a second. You mean we, as in the United States, back Pancho Villa? Yeah. We back the rebels that are being essentially under the command of Pancho Villa. So, yeah, we back Pancho Villa. And some of you may know that Pancho Villa did some pretty horrendous things. And as things go, at first, the Wilson administration's like, oh, he's going to calm things down. Well, as many of you know, that isn't the case. And it actually winds up backfiring on the United States, because then Pancho Villa decides to go a little sideways on the United States, and he crosses into New Mexico and actually attacks the United States. And then the Wilson administration's like, wait a second, wait, we supported you guys. Why are you coming over here? Because he decides that he's been empowered by us. He's going to try to invade us. So anyway, the Wilson administration then launches a posse to go after Pancho Villa. Well, Villa is never captured by or taken out by the Wilson administration. He manages to escape capture. So yeah, and actually General Pershing goes after and tries to invade Mexico and tries to bring things under control. Well, ultimately, this has dire consequences, because when we go down there to try to bring things under control with the Mexican Revolution, do you think we're greeted with open arms that go, hey guys, thank you for the assistance to try to bring things under control? No, we're not greeted with open arms. In fact, we're greeted with a great deal of hostility. And things get a little heated, to say the least. It's not a open arms, you know, we're going to treat you like fellow brothers. No, there's a great deal of hostility there towards Pershing. It's a real tense situation. And it does wind up being a very messy situation. Obviously, our interventions in Latin America, in these countries, after we've created chaos, don't always go the way the United States thinks that it should. We like to think that we are the great peacemakers, and oftentimes we make things a lot worse. We'll be talking more about how these things play out. Democracy isn't always the solution. And in fact, sometimes it brings worse things into power, as we will be talking as we get towards the end of this course, even leading in one case, well, a couple of cases, to outright genocide. Not only here on our soil, but also in several South American countries. So with that cheerful little note, as you know, from the Grim Reaper of history here, we'll move on here to bringing order to the Caribbean. So Wilson actually, Woodrow Wilson, opposed imperialism. He has a very isolationist view. That is, he had this view that we needed to stay very much out, very much focused on our nation, rather than moving towards spreading outward into the other countries. We need to focus more on America. He did not believe we needed to take over other countries, spread our interests elsewhere. He wanted to bring order to, he did, however, want to bring order to other countries. So it's kind of a dual thing. It's like you don't want to practice imperialism of taking over other countries. However, you do want to bring order to neighboring countries. So you do want to bring this kind of, you know, American ideal to our neighboring countries, but you don't want to practice imperialism. Where's the dividing line there? It's kind of contradictory, folks, I know. But there was a delineation sort of in Wilson's mind. He saw kind of a, you know, we need to bring a kind of sense of order, but not so much so that we are totally taking countries over. There was in his mind a sense of, you know, we don't want to be overbearing, but we still want to spread our ideas of democracy to other countries. Yeah. It's very fine. It's very fine. We could argue that isn't that somewhat imperialistic. Yeah, it's a fine line. We see Wilson invading more Latin America countries than any other president, however. In 1915, we invade Haiti. In 1916, the Dominican Republic, followed by Honduras, Panama, Nicaragua, and Cuba. So actually it's interesting. Even though he's spreading this message, we don't have imperialistic aims. He actually winds up invading more Latin American countries than any other president. So it's kind of an interesting thing, like I say. Yeah. Draw your own conclusions. However, when the war breaks out in Europe, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, there becomes a very strict thing that Wilson emphasizes. And we'll talk more about actually what leads to the outbreak of the war. He emphasizes this very strict idea of neutrality. The United States is not going to get involved in the war. He worries very strongly that the immigrant communities are going to start taking sides. He's very afraid that the country is going to become divided onto which side is right and which side is wrong. He begins to kind of become this advocate for brokering peace. Obviously, it is a very tense time. The Atlantic Ocean becomes this kind of feeding ground, if you will call it. We have the Germans that their U-boats begin essentially patrolling the Atlantic in what become known as their wolf packs. They begin targeting vessels, unprotected merchant vessels, and firing on them, torpedoing them throughout the war. And they become very well known for this strategy. And it becomes very well known that they're doing this. So the U.S. begins to loan money to the Allies. Now, this is the interesting thing. We've emphasized we're going to take strict neutrality, yet we start loaning money to the Allies. Even sold them goods. And we cut off the Central Powers. So even though we're playing this, oh yeah, we're going to be neutral to you guys, we're going to be totally neutral, we're playing both sides of the fence. We're going, yeah, we're going to cut you guys off, the Central Powers, and we're going to provide goods to the Allies. And this is going to have detrimental consequences that is going to start beating the drum that we're going to get dragged into the war. Because you can't be neutral in a conflict like this without it eventually dragging you into a conflict, which is ultimately what we're going to see happen in World War I. And unfortunately, it involves the tragic story of the Lusitania. You've probably heard of the story of the Lusitania. Germany had warned against ship travel in the war zones. They'd made it very clear that any passenger vessels traveling in the war zones could potentially be targets of the wolf packs. They had not fired on any so far. They've been primarily merchant vessels, that is, vessels carrying freight, that kind of thing. However, these submarine attacks would be stepped up on May 7, 1915, when the Lusitania, a passenger vessel off the coast of Ireland, unfortunately fell victim to a wolf pack, a U-boat. Now, the story of the Lusitania is one of those ones of, oh yeah, it was an innocent passenger vessel that got fired on by a U-boat. There's more of a story behind the Lusitania that we now know and has been brought to light over the years. When I was first told the story many years ago, it was an innocent passenger vessel that got fired on, and all the innocent people on board were victims of this savage attack. We now know that there's a little more to the story about the Lusitania than was first told. That's come to light over the years. And it turns out that the Lusitania was not an innocent passenger vessel. It was deliberately targeted because of a stupid move that we made of supplying our allies. Word had gotten back to the Germans that we had unfortunately stockpiled weapons on board this passenger vessel. The Lusitania was unfortunately a passenger vessel that we had done this to. By putting these weapons on board, we had knowingly made it a target of the Germans. And unfortunately, it had innocent people on board. and word had gotten back through their spy network that the Lusitania had these weapons on board to supply to the Allies. It got back to the Germans, and they sent their U-boat after it to, unfortunately, be torpedoed. And the innocent people on board the Lusitania paid the price. Nearly 1,200 were killed, and that included 124 Americans. We actually sent 124 innocent Americans to their deaths. So it's a tragic thing to think of, that we endangered our own people, innocent people, not soldiers, innocent people, to their deaths, to support weapons, to send weapons. While we were playing the role of neutral in the conflict. Yeah, it's a tragedy. And I'm sure you're probably sitting there going, wait a second, we were neutral. Yeah, we were neutral. We hadn't even entered the war. But now you know the truth. And when I learned the truth of the Lusitania's story, I was like, so there was more of a story after all, wasn't there? Yeah, that was the story. And coming out of the Lusitania's, the attack on the Lusitania, Wilson threatened Germany with war. Obviously, the deaths of 124 people, 1,200 total, seemed right to do so. So we have this movement towards war at this point. In the election of 1916, Wilson beats this drum that he's managed to keep us out of the war. Now, it's interesting to think of, on the heels of the attack on the Lusitania, he's still campaigning with this idea that he's managed to keep us out of the war. And you're thinking, wait a second, he's managed to keep us out of the war. We've had this thinking in Lusitania. Shouldn't it actually be that he needs to enter us into the war? Well, people, there's still this strong current of isolationism. People are still not keen on the idea of us going into a conflict with foreign nations. There's still this idea that we need to be removed from European conflicts. But we're soon going to see that we need to enter into this. Republican Charles Evan Hughes attacked Wilson as weak for the stance. And suffragists also campaigned against Wilson. Obviously, they're still advocating for their right to vote, so they can vote for somebody who's a strong leader. So Wilson very narrowly won. It was a very narrow margin that he won by. The last attempts at peace. So there's this peace without victory idea that actually makes it in. We actually have these initial ideas begin to crystallize that Wilson pushes for, that actually become the centerpiece of something we'll be talking about in a minute here, of what become known as his 14 points. You've probably heard rumblings of the 14 points. That Wilson's going to kind of champion. And it's self-determination, this international organization to enforce peace, are two of these gems of this 14 points. And the defeat of Russia left Germany unwilling to negotiate. Germany is still absolutely headstrong that they will not surrender. And then ultimately comes the final straw that draws us into the war. The Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram is our final piece to the puzzle of, we can't sit out of the war any longer. we've got to enter the war. We can't be outside the war any longer. It is ultimately that moment of, oh shoot, we've been out of this conflict for too long. And essentially, the Zimmerman telegram is a telegram sent by Arthur Zimmerman to the consulate in Mexico City that encourages Mexico to join the struggle to essentially invade our country, the United States, and or join the war, I should say, to help them, the help Germany, and in exchange, or in exchange for their involvement, in exchange for their support, they will ultimately give back Mexico the parts of the United States that were unfairly taken during all the land grabs by the Anglos over the period of time since we occupied the United States. Needless to say, when this telegram, word of this telegram reaches Wilson, he's incensed. He is beyond livid that the Germans are now trying to involve Mexico, that they are actually trying to band with our southern neighbors against us, trying to promise us land that is part of our nation in exchange for their involvement in the war. So this is the final straw for Wilson. He's like, okay, they're trying to involve our southern neighbors to fight against us so that they can ultimately win the war. They've gone too far this time. That's it. We're done. And ultimately, he quickly goes to Congress and calls for the declaration of war, of getting the United States into World War I. Now, ultimately, we will only be in World War I for 18 months. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the incredibly bitter reception that we received as a nation when President Donald Trump made a grand appearance at the recognition ceremonies over in Europe, acknowledging World War I during his presidency. And he took it as a personal affront. Now, we have to look at this conflict. This conflict went on for 4 years. Europe lost a huge portion of their young. They lost essentially a generation of their young men. The death toll was catastrophic for Europe. No country went untouched by World War I. On the flip side, we entered it for 18 months. Yes, we suffered casualties. But our casualties were like a drop in a bucket. Or a drop in an ocean compared to their casualties. Even back then, there was a measure of hostility. That we sat on the side and watched Europe be slaughtered. watched a generation be cut down, one boy at a time. And those feelings have largely not died away. There is still a strong current. So, for anybody, whether it be a president or an average person, to take offense, it's sad because you don't realize that the continent as a whole suffered a catastrophic loss that we will never fully understand, even with the number of losses that we suffered in World War II. We will never understand the brutal impact of World War One. It's hard for us to understand the devastation and the heartbreak. And we can't look at them as being mean-spirited or vengeful. We have to understand that they lost everything in that first war. They lost a way of life and a generation. Because World War One, as we will talk here in a minute, changed the face of Europe in a way that we don't quite comprehend. And we'll be talking about that in a minute, but I'm getting ahead of my lecture. So, anyway, the war aims of World War One led to a concert of free peoples to make the world safe for democracy. And this is where we get in to Edward House, who was a trusted advisor of Wilson, and the Inquiry, which was this group of advisors that actually start to essentially pen out what will become the skeleton for Wilson's 14 points. The idea of the League of Nations, the freedom of the seas, the open door trade, and ethnic self-determination. And we will see these become much more crystallized as Wilson moves towards the end of the war. And Wilson pitching these as the frame for a truly democratic vision of what Europe should become following the war. And anyway, the fight ultimately we see in Congress is what is going to happen with the war. Robert La Follette called for a referendum on the war. The divisions over paying for the war rise up. And then there's ultimately the discussion on the draft. You know, how are we going to institute a draft? How the draft is done. And the implementation of a draft. The draft is not a popular thing when it's first instituted. There are draft dodgers, even back in the First World War. It's not to the extent, and obviously not with the incredulous nature that it will be done as we move into future wars. But there are draft dodgers. It's not as formalized as we will see in future wars. But the draft is in its infancy during World War One. Opposition voices were silenced, and you were branded as traitors if you spoke out against any aspect of the war or the government at that point in time. And ultimately, we do have one famous person who comes out very strongly and speaks out against the war and earns himself quite a branding as a traitor during this particular time. um, which we will get to in a minute, which is Eugene v. Debs, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. So, enforcing patriotism. So, with enforcing patriotism, there's a lot of things that we see happening. We see a move towards banishing anything that is associated with anarchism. These signs of any colors, any flags that have associations with anarchism, immediately local laws go up against it. You have people that start making movements away from their family names that have any Germanic associations. They will change their names. Any words in the English language or food associations that are Germanic in origin are switched. For example, foods like sauerkraut become Liberty cabbage. We'll see this again rise up with World War II as well. These foods will again be renamed to disassociate them from their Germanic roots. This happens to strike up the patriotic vein. Even things like dachshunds, the dog. Unfortunately, there is a tragic rise in dachshund dogs being beaten to death because of their German association. It's a tragedy that these kind of actions take place, but people do not want anything that is Germanic in association. The German language stops being taught in public schools, again, because of its association with a entity that we are at war with. We will start regimenting the economy towards the war. In other words, efforts are made to help mobilize the economy towards a wartime economy. Efforts are made to for early efforts of Liberty Bond type things. We see the rise of the Red Cross. We see things of that effort being undertaken. We also see the Great Migration, which is people moving away from the South and moving towards more industrialized areas, moving towards areas where there's more economic opportunity, especially African Americans. Moving out of the areas where there is the destitution of the sharecropping system and moving towards more economic opportunity. And reforms become war measures. We're seeing these finally these reforms in the cities crystallizing into solid efforts to improve the ways of life, now seen as efforts to move the country in a positive direction, as war measures, not so much as efforts to, improve the city so much as efforts to be more patriotic, be more towards moving the country against the terrible threat of the Germans. So we do see that. And as I mentioned, Eugene v. Debs spoke out very strongly against the war. And he was a very strong opponent of the war and what it was about. and that the how could our country be democratic if it was being so unfair to the workers? And actually, this did eventually wind him up in some serious legal trouble for his outspoken nature. Um, so I do encourage you to read that section about what happened with Mr. Debs and his legal woes. He did get himself in a lot of trouble. Debs was an interesting character overall. His nature, how he eventually did run for president on the populist ticket. He had an interesting career, rising up through the ranks, and did manage to garner quite a number of votes when he did run. So anyway, with that, we're going to end this first section of our lecture and move on to our next section. So go ahead, and I will see you in the next section.